Hey, welcome back to another dispatch from Hollie McKay. Today we're going to talk about an icky subject, organ harvesting. Hollie, start us off with that.
Right. Well, this is an issue that I've been looking into really for the past 5 to 6 years. And that's organ harvesting coming out of China. And when I first heard about this, I just thought this is so preposterous. This cannot possibly be a real thing. And then as I started to dig down and talk to survivors and family members and very esteemed investigators and lawyers that were looking into this case, I started to really realize that it absolutely was a real thing, and that the CCP, as much as they do try to deny it, and of course that they do, has long for really since the 90s had a very well heeled organ harvesting process in China. And this isn't voluntary organ harvesting. These are people that are basically killed from minority groups, particularly the Falun Gong population in China. They're killed for their organs, so that these organs can be then sold to the very wealthy, the top echelons of the CCP, as well as people from other countries. And so this has been going on for a really, really long time, and it continues to go on, despite China sort of saying that in 2015 that it stopped any of the sort of the involuntary organ harvesting. So it sort of acknowledged it in that way, but it's absolutely still going on. We're still finding evidence. Lawyers and other people are still really digging into this subject. Survivors are still coming forward. And it's so barbaric and hard to imagine in this day and age that such a thing is happening.
Um, so I'm trying to wrap my head around this. And the key thing I'm trying to wrap my head around is the word involuntary. Because I've heard of this too. And in the 1990s, I was on an organ transplant charity board of directors, and there were safeguards that were put into place as part of that program, and I mean massive safeguards that were put into place as part of that program. But there was always this lingering accusation, even back then, that there was something like this that might be happening in other parts of the world. And you said this has gone back that far. How big is this in terms of the number of people involved, and
Yeah,
what's the
well,
scale of it?
estimates say, yeah, at least sort of 60,000 people a year
Wow.
are being harvested for their organs. It's a $1 billion industry. The organ trafficking, organ harvesting industry in China generates $1 billion for the government. And these are mostly coming out of China. Has about 1.5 million people in sort of concentration camps, in prisons, in labor camps. And these are mainly marginalized detainees. And so that is sort of the primarily the people. And then when the family sort of comes to find out what happened to their loved one, or they sort of receive a notification, oh, they just died. And if you read the story, I've got many anecdotes in there of people that I spoke with that have lost family members who were in prison themselves in some cases, and watched their roommates and other inmates being taken away. So sort of what happens is when everybody goes, then they have to be tested. Their blood is tested, and they're sort of verified that they're in good health. So you're actually in a bad position, really, if you are in good and optimal health, because that is sort of the target for organ harvesting. In one case, Jennifer, who I also document in the article, she was a Falun Gong member, and Falun Gong is sort of the Chinese characterize it as a cult, but I've met several members over the years, and it's sort of a little bit more of an adherence to Buddhism. They do a lot of meditation. And of course, that's not favorable under the CCP, because they have a much broader belief system than the government itself. And so they've really been persecuted since the 90s, and they were sort of the primary targets of the organ harvesting. Jennifer had explained to me that she grew up in sort of a very poor and marginalized area because her father, she was born, the year of the revolution, and her father was an intellectual, so he was very much marginalized by the new Communist Party at that point. So the hospital that her mother had to give birth was sort of a very small. It didn't have proper hygiene and resources, and she actually contracted hepatitis B at birth, but that actually saved her life because then she wasn't a viable candidate for organ harvesting, whereas the other inmates around her were. So she was able to go into quite significant detail of that process. And there is a lot of concern now with the Uyghur population, which are the Muslims in China. That I think for the last few years, unless you've been living under a rock, you'd be aware that they have been sent to concentration camps and to prisons, and basically told that they aren't able to practice their religion, and treated as terrorists essentially. And a lot of them have sort of died in this process. But there is a lot of concern now about their welfare, and that many Uyghurs I also spoke to said the same process is happening, where they're being taken, and when they're taken to these camps and prisons, their blood is taken, their vitals are all sort of checked. And this isn't the CCP, wanting to make sure that they're in good health. This is for a very specific economic purpose. And of course, family members have very little recourse to fight back. In fact, they don't have any recourse to fight back other than risk speaking out about their experience, which then, of course, puts the rest of their family in jeopardy. So it takes huge bravery, and that's really why I hope that people read the piece and listen to what these people have to say, because to speak out about this stuff is really extraordinary.
Oh gosh. Well, that's actually quite heartbreaking. I mean, I remember doing this out of a very charitable heart, and but this is not a charitable heart. This is it's farming of
It
human
is,
beings.
and it's awful. But at least what we're seeing now is a couple of things in terms of the U.S. just passed a bill. The Senate passed a bill, trying to put some stops in place to it, where individuals that are known to be part of this program, or in any way financing this program, are going to be sanctioned and banned from the US. So there are a few measures that are being put in place that are really long overdue, but very much welcomed, because action does need to be taken by governments. I think there's a lot more that we could be doing. For example, the organs are not just being used, for the sort of the wealthy population in China. It's very much a tourist game too. So even when you look at the Uyghurs, and this sounds absurd, but it's what's happening is people from a lot of the very wealthy Gulf states, which are of course Muslim majority countries, have this idea of wanting halal organs, and that's why the Uyghurs have become sort of important clientele for that. In China, you're looking at, most countries, if you are on the list for organ donation, I mean, and sadly, a lot of people die waiting for that. But you're looking at waiting for years to find that match. Whereas in China, they sort of pride themselves on this service of basically being able to find matches within days. Which is just very much unheard of in any other country. Unfortunately, people over the years have asked the United Nations and other large health bodies to look into the matter and investigate. But unfortunately, we know that the UN, and whose relationship with China is very much buddy-buddy. And the UN and some of these representatives have gone as far as to praise China for its, speedy organ harvesting program, which is just insulting and absurd. But I think they're all things to be really aware of.
Oh, that's quite an indictment of a society's value for human life that you just went over. Quite
Yeah, and
disturbing, actually.
all the while we continue to do business and tiptoe around China when egregious human rights abuses like this are happening. And so I think that people that are doing business with the CCP, they probably don't care because it's about the bottom line, but be aware of what you're getting into.
There you go. Well, Holly, a powerful statement today, and thank you for that. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Dennis.